Have you ever been silenced when your heart was screaming for justice? What would you do if truth itself was on trial? Stay with me, because this isn't just a courtroom story. This is the kind of story that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. The gavel hit the oak desk, so hard the sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. And for a second, even the dust in the sunlight froze. Every camera turned. Every pen scratched harder across paper. All pointed at one young woman standing in front of the judge, her hands trembling, clutching a plain dress stretched over the swell of her pregnant belly. Her name was Elena Marshall, and today was supposed to be the day she lost everything. Her ex-husband's lawyers circled her like a shark, tossing papers onto the desk and smirking with that rehearsed arrogance lawyers use when they think the fight's already won. Your Honor, this woman has nothing. No property, no income, no claim, he said, his voice dripping like poison into every corner of the courtroom. Elena tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but each time he cut her down with objections until her words died in her throat. Across the aisle sat Richard Hale, her ex, lounging like he owned the very air, his diamond-draped fiancée giggling beside him. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable, or so he believed. Elena had nothing, or so they thought. The judge's pen hovered over papers that would strip her of everything, and that's when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal suit sharp enough to slice through steel. The entire room sucked in a collective breath when they realized who it was. Alexander Grant, a billionaire so powerful even governments treated him like royalty. His voice thundered as he pointed at Elena. "Stop this trial. That child she carries is mine." The room detonated. Reporters screamed, cameras flashed like lightning, and Richard's smirk shattered. Elena's heart thudded so hard she thought it might tear right through her chest. She hadn't seen Alexander in months, hadn't expected to ever see him again, and now here he was, declaring paternity in front of the entire world. But before we get lost in the chaos, let me back up a second. Because Elena wasn't always the center of a billionaire scandal. She grew up the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic on the outskirts of Chicago. She knew hard work, she knew modesty, and she carried herself with a gentleness that made people trust her instantly. When she met Richard, she thought her life had changed forever, tall, polished, the kind of man who lit up a room and seemed to promise safety and success all at once. He courted her fast, married her even faster, and for a while, it felt like a fairy tale. They lived in a penthouse overlooking the skyline, attended glittering galas, and posed for photographs in magazines that called them the perfect couple. But fairy tales don't last. Richard's patience faded, his temper sharpened, and soon the man who once whispered forever was sneering at her swollen ankles and dismissing her fears about the baby as hysteria. When she found a diamond bracelet in his car that wasn't hers, he didn't even bother denying it. "Elena, you've served your purpose," he said coldly. That night, she packed a bag and left. Alone, pregnant, and terrified, she learned how to survive. She skipped meals so she could afford vitamins, rode buses to doctor's appointments, whispered to her unborn child that he was not a mistake, that he was her reason to fight. But Richard wasn't done. He sent lawyers after her like wolves, drowning her in motions until she could barely breathe. And that's how she ended up in that courtroom. Cornered, her voice stolen, until Alexander walked in. Now here's the twist, the one that flips the whole story on its head. Alexander didn't just show up for drama. He had his own scars with Richard, scars that went back years. Richard had destroyed Alexander's sister, stolen her ideas, ruined her business, left her broken. She never recovered. And Alexander never forgave him. So when he saw Elena standing on the edge of being crushed, he wasn't just saving her. He was fighting his own war. And then, as the weeks rolled on, another revelation surfaced, one that left Elena spinning. The child she carried wasn't Richard's after all. The DNA results didn't lie. The father was Alexander. The man who had just sworn to fight beside her wasn't bluffing. He was protecting his own blood. You can imagine how that hit the headlines. Overnight, Elena went from gold digger ex-wife to the woman at the center of the most scandalous triangle Chicago had ever seen. Paparazzi camped outside her building, tabloids tore her apart. Strangers whispered cruel words in grocery aisles. Richard, of course, played the victim, going on TV with Tiffany by his side, pretending to be the noble man wronged by liars. But behind closed doors, he seethed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. And let me tell you, a man like Richard doesn't handle losing well. He plotted, he threatened. He swore he would bury both Elena and Alexander. Yet what he didn't realize was that Elena was transforming. She wasn't the timid woman he once silenced. With Alexander's support and her own grit, she learned to fight back. She walked into meetings with lawyers, learned the language of contracts, stopped hiding her pregnancy under baggy clothes, and started walking tall with her head high. The tabloids that once mocked her began calling her the woman Richard couldn't break. And then came the night of the gala. Picture it, chandeliers glittering, the city's elite clinking glasses. Richard basking in the spotlight like a king in his castle. Then the doors opened, and in walked Elena, emerald gown flowing, her belly pronounced, her presence electric. The crowd gasped. The cameras turned, and Richard's face fell. She took the stage, her voice steady, and laid bare his lies, the corruption, the betrayals, the DNA results. Richard roared, spit venom into the microphone, but the mask was gone. The world saw him for what he truly was, and for the first time, they applauded her instead of him. That was her moment of triumph, her rebirth. But let's not pretend this was a neat, tied-up ending. Because when Elena walked off that stage, a reporter shouted the question that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Now that Richard's lies are exposed, what comes next for you and Alexander Grant? And she froze, because winning in public didn't erase the private battles still ahead. Richard wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And Alexander, well, his reasons for fighting went deeper than even Elena knew. So here's where I leave it with you. Was Elena's victory in the ballroom enough to secure her child's future, or was it just the beginning of a bigger war between titans? And what about Alexander? Was his vow to protect her born of justice, revenge, or something else entirely? You tell me, was this justice served? Or just another chapter in a world where power decides the truth? Drop your thoughts below. Was Elena finally free, or was she stepping into a storm even fiercer than the one she just survived? The roar of applause from that gala still echoed in Elena's ears days later. But applause doesn't pay rent, and it sure doesn't silence lawyers. You know what I mean? She had exposed Richard in front of the world, ripped off the mask he'd worn so perfectly, but what she hadn't realized yet was that men like him don't just collapse after one punch. They scheme. They crawl. They strike when you least expect it. And Richard Hale, he wasn't just angry, he was desperate. A desperate man with money and power is the most dangerous kind. The morning after the gala, Elena woke to headlines that made her heart race. Some praised her courage, called her the woman who took down a billionaire. Others, they twisted her words, painted her as unstable, unhinged. A pawn in Alexander's revenge game. Richard had already mobilized his PR machine overnight, flooding the airwaves with interviews where he shook his head, feigned heartbreak, claimed Elena was being manipulated. He played the victim so well that some people actually bought it. Watching him on screen, Elena felt sick, because she knew that charm, she'd lived under it. And she knew how many people wanted to believe it. But behind closed doors, Richard wasn't crying into his bourbon. He was furious. His empire, built on intimidation and perception, was starting to crack, and cracks invite collapse. That night, in his penthouse high above the city, he smashed a glass against the wall, shards scattering across marble. She wasn't just sitting in the background while powerful men decided her fate. She was in those rooms, listening, asking questions, forcing herself to learn. She had discovered something stronger than anger, stronger even than fear, resolve. And that resolve grew every time she pressed her hand against her belly and felt her baby move. That child wasn't just her reason anymore. It was her anchor in the storm. But here's the twist. You probably didn't see it coming. Remember how Elena thought the baby was Richard's until Alexander revealed the truth? That revelation didn't just shake her. It rattled Richard's foundation too. Because if Alexander could prove the baby was his, Richard lost every shred of leverage. No custody battle, no claim, nothing. And Richard knew it. So what did he do? He dug deeper, darker. He hired people who didn't care about laws or morals, to find something, anything, that could destroy Elena's credibility. And one night, it arrived in the form of an envelope slid under her apartment door. Elena opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photos. Grainy, shadowy, but clear enough. Her leaving Alexander's office. Alexander walking into her apartment late at night. Scrawled across the final photo in red ink. Unfit mother. Unfaithful woman. The world will believe me, not you. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just legal warfare anymore. This was character assassination, the kind Richard excelled at. She sank into her couch, clutching the photos, her chest tight. For a moment, that old fear crept back in. The fear that maybe he was right. Maybe the world would believe his lies over her truth. But Alexander didn't let her spiral for long. When he saw the photos, he didn't flinch. This is desperation, he told her, his voice steady. Richard's losing control. When a man like him plays this dirty, it's because he knows he's cornered. Elena wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to his certainty, but part of her still shook. What if the court believed Richard's narrative? What if the public turned again? What if her baby paid the price for a war between men with empires? The final act came faster than anyone expected, the custody hearing. This was the battleground Richard had been aiming for all along. If he couldn't destroy Elena in the court of public opinion, he would try to strip her of the only thing that mattered, her child. The morning of the hearing, Elena stood before her mirror, her navy dress simple, her hair tied back neatly. She looked at her reflection, hand over her belly, and whispered, "We're almost there." She walked into that courthouse not as the broken woman who once trembled in Richard's shadow, but as someone who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Richard sat across the aisle, his lawyers flanking him like an army. He looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with hatred. He still believed he could win. His lawyers painted Elena as unstable, financially incapable, emotionally unfit. They presented rumors, twisted stories, even those grainy photos. For a moment, the weight of it pressed down on her chest again. But then came her turn. She stood, voice clear, and said words that silenced the room. "I have been called weak, desperate, a liar. But none of those things are true. I am a mother, and everything I've endured has been to protect the child I carry. This is not about money. This is not about revenge. This is about love." Her lawyers laid out the evidence Alexander had unearthed, proof of Richard's fraud, testimonies from people he had destroyed, and finally, the DNA results confirming what she already knew. Richard's empire cracked with each document, each truth revealed. Even the judge, once skeptical, now leaned forward, her pen still. And then, the decision came. Custody awarded to Elena Marshall. Richard's petition denied. The words washed over her like light after endless night. She clutched her belly, whispering, "We did it." Richard erupted, slamming his fists. Screaming threats no one cared to hear as security dragged him out. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment the untouchable man finally lost. Outside, Elena faced the sea of reporters. But this time, she didn't hide. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "For months, I was afraid. Afraid of Richard, of lies, of judgment. But fear only has power if you let it. Till every woman silenced. Till every mother doubted. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And no one, no matter how powerful, can take that from you." Applause rippled through the crowd, not staged, not polite, but raw and real. For the first time, she felt the world wasn't laughing at her. It was standing with her. But let me tell you, stories like this don't end with a neat bow. That night, back in her small apartment, Alexander placed a bouquet of lilies on her table. He told her softly, "You were extraordinary today." She smiled through tears. "I was terrified. And yet you stood." He replied, "That's what strength is, not the absence of fear, but refusing to let it win." For a long moment, silence filled the room, and Elena finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why did you fight so hard for me? For us?" Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Because I lost my sister to Richard's cruelty. I couldn't save her. But when I saw you, I knew I couldn't stand by again. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about revenge. It became about you." Her heart pounded at his words, but she didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The quiet between them said enough. Weeks later, Elena stood in the nursery she had painted herself, pale yellow walls with tiny stars. The crib ready for the baby who had saved her as much as she had saved him. She whispered, You gave me strength I didn't know I had. And I promise you will never live in fear. Outside, the city still buzzed with scandal and noise, but inside, there was peace. Yet even as she rocked gently in that chair, she knew Richard wasn't done. Men like him don't disappear. They wait, they plot, they strike again. So I'll leave you with this. Was Elena's victory final, or just one chapter in a war that's far from over? And what about Alexander? Was his vow born of love? Or is there still more to his story than we know? What do you think? Was justice truly served here, or was it just borrowed time before the next storm hit?